Good morning, everyone. My name is Arnav Adhikari. I'm a student researcher from Baylor College of Medicine. I'd like to thank the Rice Ken Kennedy Institute for giving me the opportunity to present my research today. So today I'll be talking about a novel method to predict cardiac magnetic resonance-derived ejection fraction via deep transfer learning approach. So a bit of background on the topic. So echocardiography is a pretty widely used form of medical imaging in the clinical setting, and it's essentially an ultrasound image or video of the beating heart. And what they're useful for is providing insight to the diagnosis of diseases such as congenital heart disease, which originates from birth, so it's very widely studied in academia, cardiomyopathy, and other valve and chamber diseases. And what these videos are useful for sonographers and echocardiographers is they derive a large number of quantities and also qualitative measures from these videos. One of these numbers is the left ventricular ejection fraction, which is essentially just the proportion of blood that's pumped out of the left ventricle after each heartbeat cycle. So there are some problems with echocardiogram interpretation at the current moment, where interpretation in this case is essentially predicting an estimate of the LVEF. And so one problem is variability. So even though we're predicting a number which is quantitative, the interpretation is almost qualitative because of differences in skills and expertise between two echocardiographers. So if you have two echocardiographers and they look at the same video, they might give wildly different estimates just based off of their training expertise. Even intra-observer variability is there in the same echocardiographer just because of differences in perspectives as they progress over time. Another problem is time and money. So interpretation is inherently time-consuming because it does require an echocardiographer to sit through a video and derive estimates of the left ventricular volume to estimate a value for the LVEF. And then this directly corresponds to higher personnel employment costs. Next is continuity. So on weekends or holidays, when there's less faculty availability, that means there's delays in patient advisory because there's less people to interpret your video, and this can be a big problem, especially if your condition is fatal. So how do we address these issues? So naturally, we looked at deep learning, and as most of you all know, deep learning is useful for processing large volumes of image and video data, right? So why it's useful here is it produces highly reproducible measurements of cardiac cavity size and function. It improves the efficiency of human interpreters and essentially corrects for the inefficiencies from human interpreters, and therefore it lowers unit echocardiographic costs. So some key studies that have already approached deep learning with respect to predicting LVEF. So one is the EchoNet dynamic study, and it was conducted by the Stanford EchoNet group, Yang et al. So they developed EchoNet Dynamic, a model for effectively predicting ejection fraction and also segmenting the left ventricle. They had a high prediction accuracy between human and predicted EF. And so because of this, they're actually considered like a pioneer study in the field. What's nice about it is they provided their training data for researchers to use publicly, 10,030 adult echocardiograms. So it's great for researchers to use. The key insight from their study is their model architecture. So they used a spatial temporal convolutional neural network with R2 plus 1D blocks. So what this means is CNNs are widely known, most likely. CNNs are used in all kinds of fields, for tasks just like object detection, segmentation, classification, all that. And so they're widely known. Spatial temporal is the special element here where it adds the element of time. And this is important for video data because videos are, time series of 2D frames. And so what we do with the spatial temporal convolutional network is we add in these convolutional layers called temporal convolutional layers. And this is useful because when you incorporate temporal layers, now you're adding in, or you're encoding for patterns that connect spatial features over time. So you're kind of like identifying how different parts of a frame like in the heart are changing, and as a result, it's better for prediction for things like EF, which are inherently time dependent. And so what's special here is in this model architecture, you see a spatial layer followed by spatial, then temporal, then spatial, then temporal, followed by more convolutional layers, and then a pooling layer at the end. And what's important here is the alternation as well. So that's another key insight, right? So that's where the name R2 plus 1D comes from, where you're alternating between the 2D layer and then the temporal 1D layer. And so these innovations from the research field are what have caused the group to achieve high accuracy, and that's what motivates further research. A key study too is actually from the same group, the EchoNet group, and they decided to apply their findings to a pediatric population. So it was actually the first study that focused on creating algorithms for specifically pediatric patients. What they noticed is that they did have to undergo fine-tuning in order to achieve high accuracy on the pediatric population, but they were finally able to estimate EF much better with a strong p-value. Now there's still a gap. So the EchoNet group did have major breakthroughs in the field, but there's still a paucity of pediatric-based studies or studies that compare adult models to pediatric models. And then you also neglect special populations such as those with congenital heart disease. And then you also neglect other gold standards such as the CMR EF gold standard. And so the research question here is, in what ways can these EchoNet models be adapted to achieve higher performance in CHD populations and predict EF comparable to gold standards such as that of CMR? And so the methodology here is we collected echocardiogram videos from TCH's internal data sets. So from these data sets, right, so we have visits that correspond to patients, and in each of these visits, there's a number of videos. In these videos, there's multiple views, right? So a view is essentially a perspective or viewing angle of the heart. And so one such view is A4C, apical forechamber. Another is PSAX, peristernal short axis. And so these are, the most commonly used views for this kind of predictive task. So we decided to split into that as well. The EchoNet PEDS group also did this, and we did this as well because they had two models, right? One for A4C, one for PSAX. So what we did was we collected their inference weights as well. They provided their A4C weights in a public repository. Their PSAX weights, they were rederivable because luckily they published their training data online, so that was useful. But anyway, with these inference weights and videos, now we take the EchoNet models and we do some fine-tuning with them. Now this isn't just typical fine-tuning. Now we're bringing in new labels to train on. Instead of using the Echo EF from TCH's datasets, we use the CMR EF. And these CMR EFs are also from TCH data. The corresponding CMR EF label would be the visit with the closest CMR visit in time to the Echo visit. So that's where we get these CMR labels from. And then we fine-tune these models with an Atom optimizer over 50 epochs, a typical 50-25-25 split, and then we record accuracy. And so as an output, we get a series of LVEFs, right? And now we have three classes of data to compare. We have human EF, we have predicted EF, or CNN EF, and then CMR EF. So now, this is a quick visualization, right? So we have A4C videos that undergo this whole model architecture for training, and then same for peristernal short axis, and we're using CMR EF labels. So quick demographics about the population. So we had 619 videos. It was enough for this study, and these corresponded to 124 unique visits. The average age was 9.6 years, as this is a pediatric population. Average EF was 57.9%. This is slightly on the lower side, but good for this study. So results are from these two tables. So if you look at the A4C table, you see R2 of 0.53 for CMR versus predicted EF. Essentially, so CMR EF is our labels, right? And we're predicting CMR EF as a result. So 0.53 is an okay number, at least for 619 videos, compared to 0.31 for human measure versus predicted EF. And then if you look on so MAEs are pretty similar, but then if you look at the rightmost column, those are bland Altman numbers, bland Altman analysis numbers. And so you get, if you look at the limits of agreement in the parentheses, the limits of agreement are much tighter for the first row compared to the second row. So what this is telling us is that when we train these models that have already seen Echo EFs as labels, and then we start bringing in CMR EFs from the fine-tuning, now we're already seeing a substantially higher predictive accuracy, and thus it's telling us that CMR EF could actually be useful in order, or it could be useful we could predict CMR EFs to much higher accuracy compared to all these studies that have predicted Echo EF. And we see a similar story here for PSACs. Much higher R2s, but we still have a higher R2, 0.79 compared to 0.6, and substantially better bias and much tighter limits of agreement. If we look at the third row for each table, human measured versus CMR-EF, we notice that they're sandwiched in between the other two R2 values. And so this is telling us that essentially it does best to train off of CMRs and predict CMRs. And some visualizations, right? So for the scatter plot of CMR versus predicted, you see a lot less deviations compared to that of human measured versus predicted, and better Bland-Altman limits of agreement, those two horizontal lines. On the top right, you see an ROC curve. And in this ROC curve, so the blue curve represents a threshold of 50% EF, right? So the area under the curve is about 0.844, so it's pretty decent differentiating capability for above and below 50%. And that's an important threshold in cardiology because it's the distinction between a normal versus reduced EF. 55% is also a good threshold. But yeah, this is telling us that the model's performing well for these thresholds. Similar story for PSACs. We have much cleaner looking scatter plots here. Less deviations from the y equals x line over here. You can see substantially better Bland-Altman analysis limits of agreement here, as well as a better bias, and good differentiating capabilities from the ROC curves. So some conclusions. So this study does validate that the EchoNet models can accurately automate cardiac functional assessment in distinct pediatric and clinical settings. So there's potential for these models to adapt well to new populations with different factors such as congenital heart disease, as well as this population which incorporated tetralogy of Fallot patients. And tetralogy of Fallot is just distinct, or like complex heart geometries. So there's this high adaptive ability to more distinct or variable populations. And thus, so a tool that can predict CMR-EF using echoes as inputs can actually be more reliable than using conventional echo-EF measures. So that's all. I'd like to thank my collaborators from TCH and BCM, as well as Stanford University. Without their unwavering support, the study would not have been possible. And now I'd like to open up to questions.
This was a great demonstration of using deep learning in this particular use case. What was your motivation to go down this path?
Like why to use deep learning?
Why you personally wanted to deep dive into this?
Right. So if you look at the cardiology space right now, right? So it's. I went to a cardiology lab recently, and they have technology that allows them to sit through videos, and it does take time for cardiologists to predict these measures. And so I'm thinking, right, with all these studies that have applied deep learning to video data and or like have made use of models such as CNN for predictive tasks, I was thinking, hey, we can apply that pretty easily to here, and also be able to simplify the data collecting process, and give cardiologists a better view of how different gold standards compare. And so I was thinking, like, with all of these advances in computer vision these days, it should be pretty easy to make these simple innovations to make cardiologists' jobs easier, right?
So augment their decision-making process and, okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Good job.
Thank you.